Hey y'all, hi. So this is the magnetic palette in which I keep my single eyeshadows. And today I'm going to use the contents of this palette to build a smaller palette, like a curated selection of these eyeshadows that evokes a vibe that I am seeing across multiple new palette releases over the last couple of weeks. The palettes that I have pulled up on my screen that are inspiring me are the new release from Eyeshadow, the new Too Faced palette, the new Rare Beauty eyeshadow palettes, and this new release from Morphe, which is kind of interesting because it's in a different format than what we've usually seen from Morphe. It actually looks like a Too Faced palette. I'm not interested in buying any one of these palettes individually. I mean, I'm not at all interested in it. Like, I haven't even looked twice at any of them. But when I look at them all together, when I step back and look at this trend and kind of feel what it's implying, there is something there that I want to hold on to. And I think it would be foolish to follow that desire down the path that leads me to buy a new palette. I think I can recreate that and maybe create a version of it that I like better than any of these palettes using what I already have. If you're relatively new to my YouTube channel and you've never seen me film a video like this before and you like this, check the description box down below because there's a playlist that compiles all of the overhead shot videos that I've ever filmed. If you're very new and you haven't subscribed and you like this, I hope you'll consider subscribing. And now let's go ahead and get into the meat of this video. So this is a little palette that I built the last time I built my own palette. I've been using it, I really enjoyed it, but I'm going to dismantle it and put all of the shadows back into the larger collection so that I'll be able to pull from my full complement to build something new. I don't know how big today's palette will end up being. I would like it if I could fit it into this little palette. This is a really convenient size for me to keep on or in my vanity and to make a lot of use of. But for now, I'm going to set this aside. We'll see what I end up with and see what size magnetic palette I need to house it. Okay, so this is what I'm starting with today. It's a really edited collection compared to the former size of my single eyeshadow collection, but there's still a lot of variety here for me, and I find that when I build a smaller palette, even just starting with this number of shadows, which is like the size of some eyeshadow palettes that are on the market, I'm always surprised by how directional, how specific an edit can be. And I'm very curious about what I'll end up with today. Looking at my inspiration images all together, my first thought is that I'm actually a little bit surprised that I'm into it because orange eyeshadows aren't really my favorite, or actually it's not eyeshadows that have a strong orange identity. I actually don't mind those. It's the neutrals that lean extremely orange, the oranges that are kind of masquerading as browns. There used to be so many palettes on the market full of these warm neutrals that all just look incredibly orange, especially on me. And on top of the fact that it's not a very flattering undertone for me for a neutral, that kind of thing eventually started to strike me as just a little bit boring, kind of passé and done, because for so many years it was the main thing that we saw in eyeshadow palette releases. But it is like the warmth in these, that sort of harsh sun, desert shades warmth that is drawing me to them, that is kind of making me excited. It's more the rich, kind of cinnamony rust tones, though, not so much those like washed out orange leaning beiges, which are scattered through all of these eyeshadow palettes as neutrals. I don't really feel like I need to incorporate that. But the rusty, sandy, super saturated reds and oranges juxtaposed with extremely grungy, extremely textured color. So in the Too Faced, we're seeing some teals and some purples. In the Rare Beauty, we're seeing bronzes and some like dusty roses. In the Byredo, we're mostly seeing kind of washed out peach, but some burgundy. And in the Morphe palette, we're seeing a pop of strong orange. It's the juxtaposition of those that I think is what is making all of these hang together for me. So I'm looking at my collection here and I'm seeking that neutral backbone of super saturated, warm shadows and some pops of color to balance it out. I think I'm going to go ahead and pull everything that I think might work and then see what kind of effect I get when I start editing it down. Okay, so this is what I've pulled to begin with. It's interesting. There's a lot that I don't have, right? There's a lot of eyeshadow in the inspo images that there's just no correlation for here, like those matte bright yellows and oranges, even the matte peaches and all of those orange-leaning matte browns. I've pulled my closest mattes, but these lean quite neutral. They don't lean orange in that same way. Everything that I had that was like that leaned orange like that, I got rid of it because I don't like the way that I look in that kind of eyeshadow. So by pulling my closest correlations, these much more neutral, kind of gray-leaning Dove Dun matte shades, I'm on my way to building a version of this color story, this sort of like joint or combined color story that I'm seeing across these 4 palettes that's customized to me. It's been pre-customized because of the shadows that I've chosen to collect. I do think this is really pretty. Like, I feel like they would probably all fit, at least most of them. Like, I might have to kick one of them out. Do I want to keep them all? Is it as simple as that? I feel like it would make the video really short, but let me kind of talk you through what I'm thinking. So this is the closest thing that I have by far in my collection to the rusty mattes and terracottas that we're seeing in these palettes. Again, I don't have a super bright orange. I don't have a bright magenta or burgundy. I don't even have like a matte ashes of roses like we're seeing across a bunch of these. But of all of those colors, this is my favorite. Like, I like this the best. This is a lethal shadow. It's like if there's gonna be just one, there's gonna be one eyeshadow that does this thing, like this is the one I want. It's like a real terracotta clay, really rich. And lethal makes these really lovely soft shadows. So I'm very happy with that. I'm happy with the one that I have. I'm happy with that as like the backbone of my palette. And then I grabbed these 2 lighter shades because there are just so many eyeshadows in this tonal range, like these sort of pale washy shades populating all 4 of these palettes. Again, mine are more neutral than the ones that I'm seeing in the imagery, but I like them better for that. And I have been so into lips lately, like lip makeup. I've been wearing really strong lips and nothing on the eyes. And seeing these again made me realize that I might enjoy starting to put just like a little bit of a very pale neutral, matte neutral into my crease on those days when I'm wearing a strong lip and not very much else makeup. It kind of reminds me of the Terry Barber eyeshadow looks that I was really into a couple of years ago. These are the kinds of colors that I was pulling to make those Terry Barber inspired like dishwater tea bag looks, I'm actually much more excited than I expected to be to include these 2 shades, like this kind of a shade in the palette that I'm going to be using over the next month or so. And apart from this dark brown, this is the last matte that I included. It is from the Natasha Denona Gold Palette, which I just kept a few shadows from when I decluttered. And there aren't very many of these mustard shades across these palettes. There's one that's a little bit of a deeper, more brown mustard in the Too Faced palette. There's one that's kind of like this, but it's a little bit textured in one of the Rare Beauty palettes. But once again, not only is it the closest that I can come from my collection to these bright lemon yellows in the Morphe palette, for example, I also like it better than them. It's my version of them. It's not just the one that I happen to have. It's what I would get if I tinkered with some of the shadows I'm seeing on my screen to make them suit me better. So I really like having this as representation of yellow in this palette. And then this is the last matte that I included, and I kind of just did that for good measure. There aren't very many dark browns up on my screen right now, but looking over what I had selected and thinking about the looks that I might do with these shadows, I realized I would appreciate having a dark brown. So then I went looking for texture and looking to fill out my palette with textured eyeshadow that reflects the kinds of colored texture that I'm seeing on my screen. So this is like as textured as you can get because it's a true glitter, which is like a pressed glitter. It's from ColourPop. This one's called Renegade. It is kind of like a colorful bronze. It's lighter than the very alluring shadow that's at the center of the Rare Beauty palette in the center of that slide, but it generally offers something similar to that. It's not duping the shadow, but it's duping the feeling, that like textured bronzy neutral. There's also a lot of what I would call old gold across these palettes. There's one in the Too Faced palette, there's one in the Rare Beauty palette, there's one in the Morphe palette. Again, the Byredo one's kind of washed out, but there's like a paler version of a gold. And this very old Natasha Denona single, which I think might be called Old Gold, something like that. It serves to dupe the vibes of them all. And I actually think it's a bit of an innocuous shade, but it is sort of key in making the palette that I'm building reflect what I'm seeing on the screen, because it really is a thread that runs through all of those palettes. So far here, I have like a grungier, a less bright version of the backbone of the palettes that I'm duping. And by backbone, I mean like just the neutrals, but I've got the matte and the texture. So let's keep going with neutrals, actually. I picked this, even though I already have quite a lot of brown. This is an old Adept shadow. They don't sell these singles anymore, but I kept a couple that work really well for me. I put this in because I remember it having, kind of like a raisiny quality. It's brown, but it's almost like it has a little bit of burgundy in it. And there is a good bit of burgundy across these palettes, and I don't really have like strong burgundy singles. This would also look so pretty just all over the lids as a single shadow look. And you know how I love a single shadow look. Wow, I didn't do this on purpose, but they really are all going to fit perfectly. And I was just picking everything I wanted, and I picked a little 12 pan. And then this is another Adept shade. It's called Lithium. I picked this one kind of to honor the Byredo palette because I've mostly been focusing on the other three. And this, it's like that pale, rosy neutral that we see in the Byredo palette most of all. So this shade is sort of looping it in. And then here is where the color really comes in these three Cleona shades, two of which are jeweled multichromes and one of which is a glitter multichrome. It kind of makes sense because bright, strong, pure color isn't really my most collected thing in eyeshadow. I've retained some of these bright blues, these bright matte blues, because I really love them. They do come in handy building palettes also. It's nice to have a pop, a really strong saturated pop. But most of what I kept in my most recent and most vicious single eyeshadow declutter is grungy in some way. If there's color, it's like a mixed, shifting, reflective color, a very textured color. And I think that that aspect of my taste is actually part of why I'm so drawn to this Rare Beauty announcement and even to this new Too Faced palette, because the pops of color in those palettes are kind of grungy and textured as well. Some of the pops of color on the screen here, like that orange in the Morphe palette and maybe that light pinkish purple in the Too Faced palette, are too pure for me to dupe the vibes of. But again, those aren't the shadows that I would be using if I owned these new palettes. The shadows that I'd be using are the ones with like the mixed, textured, grungy color. So that's what I picked. I chose abrasion to reflect some of the blues and purples that you see here in the Too Faced palette. There isn't really blue and purple anywhere else. I mean, there's some burgundy in some of the other palettes, but the Too Faced palette is really the one that's the most colorful. And there's something that I kind of like about that. The contrast of this type of color against the backdrop, the sort of deserty backdrop. And then Forge and Kiln both have red in them. Like they both have those sort of rusty, peachy, terracotta desert tones that are dominating this color story. Forge basically shifts. I don't know if you'll be able to see it. Oh, let's do the mirror trick. There you go. So Forge basically shifts from the red you see straight on there to orange to yellow, but the yellow does lean almost a tiny bit chartreuse. There's a lot of rich color in there, but it's a little bit more in one kind of color field, which is like that red-orange field. That's Kiln, sorry. It's a little bit more singular in what it represents color-wise than Forge, which is this one. One of the greens that it shifts to is almost blue, like teal, which is something that I don't really have in my palette collection, and so wasn't really able to represent in a more monochromatic shadow. You can see it also has like a chartreusey yellow, kind of orangey yellow, and straight on this lovely mixed quality. So with these three multichromes, I'm going to get a lot of the color represented in these palettes. I'm getting it in like a mixed up, unpredictable, mysterious sort of way, which is kind of the way I prefer to have my color. And that's the palette. It really works. honestly, looking at it straight on, it doesn't look as appealing as some of these palettes that have just come onto the market. I think because we're getting such a strong blue, the impression of abrasion is of such a strong blue rather than that burgundy or purple, which it actually does shift to, especially when it's on the eyes. It's not like the prettiest tree in the choir, you know, but I think that I'm going to really love the looks that I get from it. Because remember, when you apply an eyeshadow palette, you don't end up with your eyes looking like the entire palette. You're always editing. So even though I've already edited my larger collection down to these 12 shadows, when I apply them to my eyes, I think more often than not, it's just going to be one of them, you know, like just this one or just this one or just that one, maybe with a scattering of textured shimmer or multi-chrome flash across it. But let's swatch them out and see how they look. You know, I actually think that this is a palette that looks better swatched out than it does in the pans. And it's partly because you can really see some of the colors in these last three shades. Like the swatches are really drawing them out, especially when they were on my fingers. You could really see some of the nuance and just how much color is actually added to the palette by those. But even the matte part of the palette and, you know, these neutrals, I just feel like they look richer and more sophisticated when they're swatched out and they kind of hang together a little better than the palette itself does. So swatching it out has actually made me even more excited to use it. And I do feel like I've successfully duped the vibes of my inspo palettes, but also done it in a direction that's more usable for me, more realistic, more aligned with the way that I do my eyeshadow on a daily basis, and more inspiring for me than any one of these palettes new to the market would be. And of course, the formulas are all really great. I've handpicked each one of these individually and decided to keep it through declutter after declutter. Every single one of them probably would outperform any one of those Morphe shadows, for example, and maybe even the Byredo, Too Faced, and Rare Beauty as well. So it came together incredibly quickly. I just picked 12 without even counting, popped them all in the pan, and now we're ready to go. But it was totally gratifying for me, and I hope that you enjoyed it as well. Thank you for being here. Again, check the playlist in the description box down below if you'd like to see more of this kind of video. And please don't forget to take extra good care of yourself so that you can be the most effective version of yourself as you do your work in the world.